Да, безусловно. Они будут пытаться делать ставку на так называемую пятую колонну, на национал-предателей, на тех, кто зарабатывает деньги здесь, у нас, а живет там. И живет даже не в географическом смысле этого слова, а по своим мыслям, по своему рабскому сознанию. Я совсем не осуждаю тех, у кого вилла в Майами или на французской ривьере, кто не может обойтись без фуагра, устриц или так называемых гендерных свобод. Но проблема абсолютно не в этом, а, повторю, в том, что многие из таких людей по своей сути ментально находятся именно там, а не здесь, не с нашим народом, не с Россией. Это и есть, по их мнению, признак принадлежности к высшей касте, к высшей расе. Подобные люди готовы и мать родную продать, только бы им разрешили сидеть и кушать в этой самой высшей касте. И они хотят быть похожи на нее, всячески подражая ей. Но они забывают или не понимают вообще, что этой так называемой высшей касте они, если и нужны.
Good afternoon, I am Renaldo McKenzie, and welcome to another episode of the Neoliberal Round podcast. Today, we have breaking news, and we have an update as to what's going on in the war with Ukraine and Russia. We obtained a published piece calling for full-blown genocide and destruction of Ukraine as a state. Again, Russian state news agency published a piece calling for full-blown genocide and destruction of Ukraine as a state. And we obtained this from a news source and from Ukraine, the Ukrainian news source. But again, today we will be sharing a published piece calling for full-blown genocide and destruction of Ukraine as a state. And just before I do so, you may recall that some time ago, I published an article entitled Putin's Speech, March 16, 2022. He reveals his mind. Again, some time ago, via Renaldo McKenzie Studios on YouTube, I shared a YouTube video where Putin gave a speech and he revealed his mind. And Putin's speech on March 16, 2022 is similar. This article resembles Putin's ideologies and is part of the Russian propaganda to justify a war that they are losing. I wrote Putin's latest speech, March 16, 2022. He reveals his mind. I delve into it here, lifting up some very important points and highlight red flags and signal a warning for us in the world. And I said, let us watch Putin's esoteric speech. And I'm going to play a bit of it for you and translate it. And then I am going to delve into this piece that was published by the Russian news agency. Listen to the Putin speech delivered. Yes, of course. The West will bet on the so-called gift column, on the national traitors. And those who earn money here with us can't live there. And they live not even in the geographic sense of the world or the word, but according to their thoughts, according to their Slavish consciousness. We do not at all judge those who have a villa in Miami or on the French Riviera, who can't do without choreograph horses or the so-called gender freedoms. The issue here is not in that, but in the fact that many of these people, by their very nature, are mentally located exactly there and not here, not with our people, not with Russia. This is in their opinion, a sign of belonging to a higher caste, to a higher race. Such people are ready to sell their own mother, if only they were allowed to sit in the hallway of this very highest caste. They want to be like her, meaning caste, imitating her in every way, yet they forget or do not understand at all that if they are needed by these core, then they are only needed as expendable material in order to use them to inflict maximum damage on our people. The collective West is trying to split our society, speculating on the combat losses and the socio-economic consequences of our actions, provoking a civil confrontation in Russia and using its fifth column to achieve its goal. And there is only one goal. I have already spoken about it, the destruction of Russia. But any people, and even more so the Russian people, will be able to distinguish true patriots from scum and traitors, and simply spit them out like a midge that accidentally flew in your mouth. Spit them out. I am convinced that such a natural and necessary self-purification of society will only strengthen our country, our solidarity, cohesion, and readiness to respond to any challenges. That was President Putin on March 16, 2022. And yes, this particular speech forms the ideological basis of the article that was published by the Russian state news agency. This drive, and just so you know, and maybe we should say the Putin news agency, because who controls the Russian state agency? And when we talk about the issue of information, because we said that communication is to make popular what was the monopoly. But the article begins this way. It says, back in April last year, we wrote about the inevitability of denazification of Ukraine. We do not need a Nazi, and they're in Ukraine, an enemy of Russia, and an instrument of the West to destroy Russia. You see here, I just played the Putin's March 16, 2022, and I revealed to you his suspicions, and he's calling the Ukrainians the fifth column and indicating and saying that they are being used to inflict maximum damage on Russia. And he is saying we should spit them out like the traitors, like the scums that they are. So here it is, the Russian news agency, the Russian state agency published a recent article, and it says, back in April last year, we wrote about the inevitability of denazification of Ukraine. We do not need a Nazi, and they're in Ukraine, an enemy of Russia, and an instrument of the West to destroy Russia. Today, the issue of denazification has moved to the practical plane. Denazification is necessary when a significant part of the people, most likely its majority, is mastered and dragged by the Nazi regime into its politics. That is when the hypothesis, and I quote, the people are good, the government is bad, end of quote, does not work. Recognition of this fact is the basis of the policy of denazification of all its activities, and the fact itself constitutes its subject matter. Ukraine is in just such a situation. The fact that Ukrainian voters voted for Poroshenko's peace and Zelensky's peace should not be misleading. Ukrainians were quite happy with the shortest route to peace through Blitzkrieg, which the last two Ukrainian presidents transparently hinted at when they were elected. It was precisely this method of pacification, of internal and anti-fascist through total terror that was used in Odessa, Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk, Mariupol, and other Russian cities. And just so you know that Mariupol and Kharkov and some of these are actually in Ukraine, but the article is referring to them as Russian cities. The article continues. Denazification is a set of measures towards the Nazified mass of the population, which technically cannot be directly punished as war criminals. Nazis who have taken up arms must be destroyed as much as possible on the battlefield. no significant distinction should be made between the AFU and the so-called National Security Forces, as well as the territorial defense militias that have joined these two types of military formations. All of them are equally engaged in outrageous cruelty against civilians, equally responsible for the genocide of the Russian people. And they do not observe the laws and customs of war. And just so you know, here they are levying an accusation saying they do not observe the laws and customs of war. Yet Putin and Russia does not observe laws. And that is the thing with power, and which is an issue of Pharisaicalism. And we talk about the bureaucratic phenomenon, Michael Kruse, bureaucratic phenomenon, where people set rules, but they don't expect the rules to govern them. It doesn't apply to them. It only applies to others, as if the rules are set up to maintain, establish, or create their advantage over others. Because here it is that Putin did not want the West and the United Nations to implement a no-fly zone because of some agreement between the Soviet Union and the United Nations or the G8, or not the countries between the Soviet Union and the United Nations, or those countries, the power bloc that negotiates the Security Council of the world was set up after the fall of the breakup of the Soviet Union. There was an agreement between these countries, the Soviet Union and the Security Council, which was formulated. NATO, we're talking about NATO here. So, Russia does not want, or Putin does not want, NATO to implement a no-fly zone because of the agreement between NATO and Russia. But yet still, Putin and Russia has been going around the world breaking every humanitarian law. The article continues. It says, war criminals and active Nazis must be punished approximately and exemplarily. A total lustration must be carried out. Any organizations that have linked themselves with the practice of Nazism must be eliminated and banned. However, in addition to the top brass, a significant portion of the masses of the people who are passive Nazis, collaborators of Nazism, are also guilty. They supported and indulged the Nazi government. Just punishment for this section of the population is possible only as the bearing of the inevitable burdens of a just war against the Nazi system waged as gently and discreetly as possible against civilians. The further denazification of this mass of the population consists in re-education, which is achieved by ideological repression or suppression of Nazi attitudes and harsh censorship, not only in the political sphere, but necessarily also in the sphere of culture and education. It was through culture and education that the profound mass Nazification of the population was prepared and carried out, consolidated by the promise of dividends on the Nazi regime's victory over Russia. Nazi propaganda, internal violence and terror, and the 8-year war with the rebel Ukrainian Nazi people of Donbass. Denazification can only be carried out by the victor, which presupposes 1, his unconditional control over the denazification process, and 2, the power to ensure such control. In this respect, the denazified country cannot be sovereign. The denazifying state, Russia, cannot proceed from a liberal approach to denazification. The ideology of the denazifier cannot be challenged by the guilty party undergoing denazification. Russia's recognition of the need for denazification of Ukraine means, again, let me read that. Russia's recognition of the need for denazification of Ukraine, not Ukraine recognition in their own. It is Russia, Mother Russia, Russia's recognition, as if Ukraine is not sovereign, as if they don't have their own identity. The article says Russia's recognition of the need for denazification of Ukraine means the recognition that the Crimean scenario is impossible for Ukraine as a whole. However, the scenario was also impossible in 2014 in the rebellious Donbass. Only 8 years of resistance to Nazi violence and terror led to internal cohesion and a consciously unequivocal mass refusal to preserve any unity and connection to Ukraine, which defined itself as a Nazi society. You see what's going on here? Russia. I said to you, I'm writing a book on. I'm doing a book project, and it's entitled "Position, Power, Privilege, and Status." And here we're seeing an issue of power, because issues begin, and this is an issue of ethnocentrism, because it is as if the Ukrainians don't have a sense of the individual. And I said to you, what is the ultimate of all things? The ultimate of all things is that we live together as one with reality, with all of our individualities. And I say, and I continue in that particular theme, in that particular, one of my first blog posts, I wrote that, and I continue by saying, a man said once you label me, you negate me. And that's what is happening here. Russia and Putin is negating the individual, negating the individuality, the sovereignty, the nation. And they are creating, so the first thing, and that is the issue of power, that is the strategy of power. They create an identity for the other. And that is why sometimes you ask me, how do you identify? I say, I am first Renaldo. I do not identify as one thing or the other, because once I tell you, how do you identify, then immediately these labels conjures up images in people's mind of who and what or who I am. And then more often than not, the approach and the engagement, how we engage the individual, is then colored by the images that you conjure up in your mind based on the labels of identity that these labels carry with it. So when you ask me who I am I am Renaldo, and then we can have a discussion about who I am and so on and so forth. That is important. But the issue of labor is important. If you look, and I said to you, the issue, race is a pseudoscience, race is a strategy. Categories in society is the downfall of society. It's a challenge for society and for humanity and for progress. Because it provides an opportunity. It facilitates it facilitates destruction. And I talk about Orientalism and Occidentalism. And I share a story from Edward Said's book when he talks about Orientalism. Talk about ideas that the East have about the West and how the ideas of the East about the West is the East sees the West as irreligious. And so they carry out attacks like 9/11 and so on and so forth. It's justified based on values, because they believe that their values are better than the Western values, and everyone should, even in religion, you have those values. And I say to you, even when you study globalization and the global dynamics in the world, and I talk about in my book, Neoliberalism, Globalization, Income Inequality, Poverty and Resistance, when I talk about the bureaucratic phenomenon, how countries came together and create WTOs and international organizations that would help to facilitate trade and set rules, But at the end of the day, when the rules aren't applicable to everyone, because few people who already have advantage set rules and they dilly-dally around these rules. They circumvent these rules. But the other countries, such as the global south countries, were forced to abide by certain rules, especially already they have limited resources, and so they have to go to the international, the big countries, the post-industrial countries to ask for money. And they are already part of a World Trade Organization with rules. And when you go to the IMDb or the Inter-American Bank or the International Monetary Fund, and when these countries went and asked for loans, where is the money come from? Where does the IMDb get the money? Where does the World Bank get the money? Where does the IMF get? They get the money from the post-industrial, the developed countries. Lend them this money, and that, of course, there are conditions. And then these bodies then lend these other countries money. Then the loan comes with certain conditions that hold them back, that prevent them from meaningfully competing in the global world, in a globalized world. And that's what has happened. And so conditions prevent them from competing. And then the rules don't favor, because I say to you, while some countries could not subsidize their local economy and the farmers and so on and so forth and their industry, the other countries were doing that and then penetrating and flooding these local markets. And that's what you see, the issue of power, the issue of privilege, the issue of status within society, and how society creates certain rules and organizations, and then expect only certain people to abide by these rules. We call this Pharisaicism. Do as I say, but not as I do. This is it, okay? And of course, we still continue to see. But of course, what we do, we create labels, meanings. That's what power does. It moves away. And I said to you some time ago, I had an interview with the owner of the Ubuntu Fine Arts Gallery. And if you listen to one of my podcasts, I interview this gentleman, Stephen C.W. Taylor. And I asked him about Ubuntu, and Ubuntu talks about the individual, respecting the individual, valuing the individual, and moving away from ethnocentrism. But even though we have an idea of this issue of, we understand ethnocentrism, and even though we understand human tendency to judge others based on their own value, and that creates conflict in society, people still cannot move away from that because of this greed, because of this drive for power. And he talks about this Ubuntu principle of the individual. We talk, earlier I shared an article about Orientalism and Occidentalism, and Edward Said talks about that. And actually, I was at Georgetown University, and we were looking at the foundation of knowledge. And one of the things that we talked about as we looked at Orientalism and Occidentalism, but more so Orientalism. And I did a paper, and because I wanted to compare Orientalism with Occidentalism, because Orientalism is looking at Western views about the East, and Occidentalism is looking at Western views about the East, because Eastern views about the West is that the West is irreligious, and that justifies wars. While in Occidentalism, the West is saying, well, the East, they have certain ideas about the East. They're fundamentalism, or they're lacking in intellect, and so on and so forth. And of course, you see that when Putin talks about this value, there's suspicions about the other. Because people want to penetrate the other, and so they try to define the other. It's exactly what is happening. Putin is here defining Ukraine as if Ukraine isn't a nation. They don't have an idea about the sense of self, which is what happened with slavery. And the issue of power comes here again, because what happened in slavery was to first to define a particular person. Went to Africa, okay, and define these people as livestock. Come up with a strategy to define them, stripping away their individuality. So that's what has happened here. You strip away their individuality, their humanness. And after you strip away the slave or that person's individuality, now you can use them. You can penetrate them, you can abuse them, you can dominate them in a sense. And that is the problem for society. This penchant to strip away an individual's individuality and then to penetrate and to dominate and to control. And we do that by creating labels, creating races and divisions and so on and so forth. That is a problem for society. That is the exact motivation for this war. And you hear it in this article, the recurring theme. The denazifying state, Russia, cannot proceed from a liberal approach to denazification. The ideology of the denazifier cannot be challenged by the guilty party. Russia's recognition of the need. And when I talk about Occidentalism, Egypt, there is an article by a British author. If you check the archives or the history book, there is a presentation by a parliamentarian. I believe his name is Balfour. And in his speech to Parliament, when Egypt was occupied, was a colony of Britain. This parliamentarian who was responsible for the management and the overseeing of Egypt, he was a British parliamentarian, was in Parliament justifying why Britain should continue to remain as Egypt's masters. Why Egypt? In fact, the speech suggests that Britain knows or England knows what's best for the Egyptians. The Egyptians do not know what's best for them. In fact, if there's anything positive that has happened in Egypt was because they were occupied. They were occupied. Anything good that has come out, and the conversation and the speech, in his speech, is as if anything positive that the Egyptians can celebrate, it's only positive because of external forces, because the Egyptians they are ordinary people. They lack a particular kind of European intelligence that is the standard, and a way of thinking and operating. And that is what has happened, this kind of ethnocentrism, privileging the English way of life over the Egyptian way of life, and then imposing that. And in a sense, Putin is also saying that he believes that the West is privileging their way of life and using Ukraine to penetrate. But Ukraine, this is a schizophrenic situation for Ukrainians, because it is as if they're in the middle. Because it's as if they do not have any say. Weaker countries or people who are at the other end of the stick do not have any power. They are sandwiched between capitalism and socialism, West and East. And this is part of the problem and the challenge for society. And I said to you that we are holding on to a thread. The article continues because it's a very long article. It goes on to say that the time frame for denazification can in no way be less than one generation who must be born, grow, and mature under the condition of denazification. The denazification of Ukraine has lasted for over 30 years, starting at least in 1989, when Ukrainian nationalism gained legal and legitimate forms of political expression, and led the movement for independence towards Nazis. So you see, Russia is trying to define the individual. So the Ukrainians don't have a say in who they are. Ukraine is a sovereign nation, but they are defined, and that is, I tell you, that is what power does. And those who privilege a particular position and try to, power uses various means. It will use passive means through systems and laws, and if that doesn't work, coercion. And the coercion is used so they have stripped away the individuality, the sovereignty, the person, the humanness. Then after you have done that, you move to carry out some act of war or violence. That is what has happened. And they are trying to define, in fact, they are even trying to redefine Ukraine's independence, to say that their independence is not an independence for a true independence, but with an independence so that they can practice Nazism. Diluting people's experience. In this article, you can see what's happening, and they are not even aware of this. The article, it suggests this dynamic, this power dynamic, as if mother is chastising a child. Okay? As if mother is chastising a child. That's what it is. The Ukraine is a child. And the mother knows what's best and is applying and is chastising it. This is the issue. This is an issue of power. They are trying to, and here it is that Putin and the article is saying that their independence is not true independence. Their independence is one towards Nazis. But what are the Ukrainians saying? Who is saying that? Only the aggressor. When you look at dynamics, human dynamics in the world, when you study power in the world and look at victimizations, that is always the abuser always try to try to justify his abuse of the other by redefining the other person, redefining the victim as being threatening, redefining the victim as being threatening. Now the article continues by saying the peculiarity of modern Nazified Ukraine is its amorphous and ambivalent nature, which allows Nazism to be disguised as aspirations for independence and the European, Western, pro-American path of development. In reality, degradation. In other words, again, let me read that. The peculiarity of modern Nazified Ukraine is its amorphous and ambivalent nature, which allows Nazism to be disguised as aspirations for independence and the European, Western, pro-American path of development. In reality, degradation. If Ukraine, who is a sovereign country, choose an independence towards European that is Western and American, then to Russia that is degrading. That is Nazism, and that is what they're trying to root out. In reality, to degradation. To claim that the article continues, in reality, to degradation, to claim that there is no Nazism in Ukraine. So they're saying that, they're just saying Ukraine have ideals of being a developed country, resembling the American development. But that is just Nazism. In fact, the article didn't address it, but that's what Nazism is in this article. The article continues by saying there is no main Nazi party no FURA, and no full-fledged racial laws, only a stripped-down version in the form repression of the Russian language. As a consequence, there is no opposition and no resistance to the regime. However, all of the above does not make Ukrainian Nazism a light version of German Nazism of the first half of the 20th century. On the contrary, as Ukrainian Nazism is free from such genre political technology, in essence, frames and restrictions, it unfolds freely as the fundamental basis of all Nazism, like European, and in its most developed form, American racism. You see, that is exactly their talk. So they're saying the Nazism that they're trying to drain Ukraine of is not one that was Hitleric or Hitlerian, but it is one that is American racism. Therefore, Nazification cannot be carried out in a compromising way on the basis of a formula such as NATO, no EU. Yes, the collective West itself is the designer, source, and sponsor of Ukrainian Nazism, while the Western Bandera cadres and their historical memory are only one of the instruments of the Nazification of Ukraine. Ukro-Nazism is no less of a threat to peace and Russia than German Nazism of Hitler's modification. The article continues. The name Ukraine cannot apparently be retained as the title of any fully denazified state formation on any territory freed from the Nazi regime. The People's Republics, newly established in Nazi-liberated territory, must and will grow out of the practice of economic self-government and social welfare. The reconstruction and the modernization of the population's life support system. I'm going to read it again. The article continues, goes on to say, the name Ukraine cannot apparently be retained. They want to strip Ukraine of the name Ukraine. The name Ukraine cannot apparently be retained as the title. It's the same thing with slavery. They want to strip them of the language and strip them of any identity. I just said to you, power does that. The strategy of power, it strips away the individuality and your identity. The name Ukraine cannot apparently be retained, according to the article, as the title of any fully denazified state formation on territory freed from Nazi regime. The People's Republics, newly established in Nazi-liberated territory, must and will grow out of the practice of economic self-government and social welfare. The reconstruction and modernization of the population's life support systems. Their political aspirations, Ukrainians' political aspirations, in fact, cannot be neutral. Redemption of guilt towards Russia for treating it as an enemy can only be realized in reliance on Russia in the processes of reconstruction, regeneration, and development. No Marshall Plan for these territories should be allowed. There can be no neutrality in the ideological and practical sense compatible with denazification. The cadres and organizations that are the instruments of denazification in the new Nazified republics cannot but rely on the direct power and organizational support of Russia. Denazification will inevitably be de-Ukrainianization, a rejection of the large-scale artificial inflation of the ethnic component of the self-identification of the population of the territories of historical Malorussia and Novorossiya, which the Soviet authorities started. As a tool of communist superpower, artificial ethnocentrism did not remain orphaned after the fall of communism. In this service capacity, it was taken over by another superpower, power over states. the superpower of the West. It needs to be returned to its natural boundaries and stripped of its political functionality. So there's an issue of boundaries. They are nervous of this American, this Western hold that is close to their borders. They are suspicious of that. And not only that, they're suspicious, of course, not only that, they believe that their power is waning. Mother Russia's hold on the region is waning as all of these other European countries or former USSR countries adopt more Western policies, Western style of development and Western life. But can I tell you, this is not just an issue for the Poland and Ukraine and the other countries in the region, Lithuania and so on. There are all other countries, even in Russia, the young people are also adopting that style, this Western value, lifestyle and appetite. And I think that is what's happening. So conservative Russians are, in a sense, responding or reacting to this, as if, because that's what happened. They feel as if their power and their control and the extent of their power is waning. Well, so that's another reason for power. It's a reaction and justification for the war. It's a reaction. Whenever the power, those in power feel as though their control is waning, then there is always reactive means. And of course, they use systematic means to countervail any kind of new ideological developments that seem to be mitigating against the status quo. The article continues by saying, unlike, say, Georgia and the Baltic countries, Ukraine, as history has shown, is impossible as a nation state, and attempts to build such a state inevitably lead to Nazism. Ukrainianism is an artificial anti-Russian construction with no civilizational content of its own, a subordinated element of a foreign and alien civilization. De-banderization in itself will not be enough for denazification. The Banderite element is only a performer and a screen, a disguise for the European project of Nazi Ukraine. So the denazification of Ukraine is also is inevitable. The Europeanization. The Banderovian top brass must be eliminated. It is impossible to re-educate them. The social swamp that actively and passively supported it through action and inaction must survive the hardships of the war and assimilate the experience as a historical lesson and atonement for its guilt. Those who did not support the Nazi regime, who suffered from it and the war it unleashed in Donbass, must be consolidated and organized, must become the support of the new government. It's vertical and horizontal. Horizontal experience shows that wartime tragedies and dramas benefit peoples who have been seduced and carried away by the role of Russia's enemy. Denazification, as the goal of the special military operation itself, is understood as a military victory over the Kiev regime, the liberation of territories from armed supporters of Nazification, the elimination of intransigent Nazis, the capture of war criminals, and the creation of the systematic conditions for subsequent peacetime denazification. The latter, in turn, should begin with the organization of local self-government, police, and defense bodies cleansed of Nazi elements, launching on their basis the founding processes of the new Republican statehood, integrating the statehood in close cooperation with the Russian Denazification Agency, the newly created or remade, say, from Russia to Moscow. with the adoption under Russian control of a Republican regulatory framework legislation for denazification, defining boundaries and frameworks directly in this respect. Russia should act as a custodian of the Nuremberg's process. Whatever, Russia is still trying to insert themselves. They want to de-European, denazify, de-Westernize Ukraine and set up their own government and create their own rules and own laws so as to maintain Mother Russia, so as to maintain their hold. So, Russia, I don't understand. Russia was hoping in 1989 Russia was hoping to disengage from their colonial activities, but still have a sway over these countries. It's that if these countries, you can run your own country and do what you need to do. You can elect your own government. But remember that Russia is your head of state. And I argued that recently that Jamaica is celebrating 30 years of independence. And if you read my book, I said many of the independence that some of these countries have, they're not really independent. The fact that they are so dependent and they're locked into this globalized world, into agreements that continue to keep them back. And at the same time, they still have the Queen as their head of state. And if people the Queen has to still apply her seal, and if people if people on the mainland want to appeal a particular decision of the court, they have to go to Britain. This is absolutely ridiculous. This is absolutely ridiculous. But anyway, let's continue with the article. The article continues by saying all of the above means that in order to achieve the goals of denazification, the support of the population, their transition to Russia, after being freed from the terror, violence, and ideological pressure of the Kiev regime, after being removed from the informational isolation is necessary. Of course, it will take some time for people to recover from the shock of military action and to become convinced of Russia's long-term intentions, that they will not be abandoned. It is impossible. I mean, they are justifying why they want to take over another country and to impose that country's will. The article continues. You see, they feel as though they are justified. The article continues. It is impossible to foresee in advance in which territories this mass of population will constitute a critically needed majority. The Catholic province, West Ukraine, is unlikely to be part of the pro-Russian territory. The line of exclusion, however, will be found by experience. A hostile to Russia, but possibly neutral and demilitarized Ukraine with formerly banned Nazism will remain behind it. Russian or Russia haters will go there. A guarantee that this residual Ukraine will remain neutral should be the threat of an immediate continuation of military cooperation if the listed requirements are not met. This would probably require a permanent Russian military presence on its territory. From the Canadian line and up to the Russian border would be the territory of potential integration into Russian civilization. Fascist in its inner nature. Ukraine's denazification operation, and that's the special operation. The operation is, and that is why I'm telling you, right now there's peace talk between Ukraine and Russia, but there is no peace talk. It's a facade. They're just buying time. Because if Russia still have these ideas about Ukraine and ideas about Mother Russia and Russian values and ideologies, and I maintain their suspicion of the West and have ideas that involves dominating and controlling all of that particular region, Russia and the region surrounding, then there is no peace, because the Ukrainians are not giving up their independence. And they will continue to resist because they recognize themselves as individuals, as soul, people with soul and with value, as human beings who have an idea about how they want to live their lives and the type of country that they want. And it is not one that involves Russian value. And that's a problem for Russia because it affects their ability to control. The article continues by saying, liquidation of armed Nazi formation. I'm gonna repeat this again. Ukraine denazification operation, which began with a military phase, will follow in peacetime the same logic stages as a military operation. At each of them, irreversible changes will have to be achieved, which will be the results of the corresponding stage. The necessary initial steps of denazification can be defined as follows. 1. Liquidation of the Nazi formations, understood to mean any armed formations of Ukraine, including the armed forces of Ukraine, as well as the military, informational, and educational infrastructure supporting their activities. The formation of people is self-government and police, defense and law and order in the liberated territories of the terror of underground Nazi groups, installation information space, removal of educational materials and the prohibition of educational programs at all levels contain Nazi ideological attitudes, massive investigations into personal responsibility for war crimes against humanity, dissemination of Nazi ideology and support for the Nazi regime. This is exactly what they did. You know what? This is how control of power works. You know, when slaves, during the slave trade, they separated the slaves into various tribes so that they wouldn't be able to understand each other and communicate with each other. All the strategy, all the systems that they're coming up with in their whole, they're able to install their government. And that's what they're trying to do. There is no peace. The only peace is when they have installed the government. And they are saying that there is no peace. Well, if there's no negotiation, there's no negotiating this peace. There's no negotiating. They're not giving up Crimea, Donbass, Mariupol, and these other countries, and leaving the rest of Ukraine to still be infested with Nazi value, which they call Western value, which can still penetrate the other areas that they have now taken control of. So Russia's operations, military operation in Ukraine doesn't stop with taking over 3 or 4 cities and towns and regions. It involves taking control of all of Ukraine. All of Ukraine. So the article continues by saying part of the process, the formation of people's self-government and police and so on and so forth, part of and liberating the territories and protecting the population from the terror of underground Nazi group. Part of the process not only involve removal of education materials and the listing disclosures of the names of collaborators and the adoption of the local level under Russian curatorship of primary denazification, but also establishing memorials, commemorative signs, monuments to the victims of Ukrainian Nazism, commemorating the heroes of the struggle against it. The inclusion of a set of anti-fascist and denazification norms in the constitutions of the new people's republics. Creation of permanent denazification bodies for a period of 25 years. Russia will have no allies in denazification of Ukraine, as this is a purely Russian affair, and also a purely Russian affair. And also because not just the Bandera version of Nazi Ukraine will be eradicated. In other words, Ukraine idea of who they want and what they want. And that's what happened. Some of these countries that negotiate their independence, they negotiated their independence. And an independence that was acceptable by those who are empowered, where they can continue to keep their hold. But if people want an independence where they accept different set of values and a different set of vision that runs incongruous to those who are now abdicating their power, then it becomes a problem. And then what happens is that they reconsider and retake. So Russia will have, so the article says Russia will have no allies in the Denazification of Ukraine, as this is a purely Russian affair, and also because not just the Bandera version of Nazi Ukraine will be eradicated, but also, and above all, Western totalitarianism, imposed programs of civilizational degradation and disintegration, mechanisms of subordination to the superpower of the West and the USA. The article continues, in order to implement the plan of denazification of Ukraine, Russia itself will have to finally give up its pro-European and pro-Western illusions to realize itself as the last instance of protection and preservation of those values of historical Europe, the old world. The old world I talk about, it's the old holding on. They're holding on, which deserved it, and which the West ultimately abandoned, having lost in the struggle for itself. This struggle continued throughout the 20th century and manifested itself in the World War and the Russian Revolution, inextricably linked to each other. Russia did everything it could to save the West in the 20th century. It realized that the main Western project, the alternative to capitalism, which defeated the nation states, the socialist-led project, it crushed German Nazism, the monstrous spawn of the crisis of Western civilization. The last act of Russian altruism was Russia's outstretched hand of friendship, for which Russia received a monstrous blow in the 1990s. You see that's what power does. Or those in power, they start to talk about what good they have done to help the other. So they started to list their efforts, which aren't efforts, which are at best fantastic, talking about how Russia has helped to preserve West and their values from Nazi penetration. But if you study history, that is not true about, because history will tell you where Russia has been on the side of World War I and World War II. But let's continue. Every Russia, according to the article, every Russia or everything Russia has done for the West, it has done it has done at its own expense by making the greatest sacrifices. The West eventually rejected all these sacrifices, devalued Russia's contribution to resolving the Western crisis, and decided to take revenge on Russia for the help it unselfishly provided. So Russia thinks that its effort to denazify it, this particular article is so conflicting and so ambivalent. It is suspicious of the West and saying that it is trying to drain Ukraine of Western ideological values, that is penetrating its value, that is penetrating its own borders. And at the same time, it is saying that, at the same time, they're saying Russia has helped to defend and to preserve the West from Nazism and from certain values and principles that runs against it. And it is also saying that this particular war is also Russia is a war. It's Russia trying to help the West. It's part of the sacrifice it is making to help the West. Everything that Russia has done for the West, it has done at its own expense by making the greatest sacrifices. That's what it says. The West eventually rejected all these sacrifices, devalued Russia's contribution to resolving the Western crisis, and decided to take revenge on Russia for the help it unselfishly provided. Help it. This is a psychological problem. We hear, narcissist. This is how narcissists think. You already, and that's the issue of power as well. Eventually, they believe that the privilege that they have in society, it comes from above, it comes from God. They are supposed to be where they are. They believe that they are supposed to be in power. And that's what happens, when people create certain stratospheres and levels in society, and so on and so forth. Welcome back. Before the interruption, we were wrapping up this article entitled Russian State News Agency published a piece calling for full-blown genocide and destruction of Ukraine as a state. And we were at the end of the publication, which says everything Russia has done for the West, it has done at its own expense by making the greatest sacrifices. The West eventually rejected all these sacrifices, devalued Russia's contribution to resolving the Western crisis, and decided to take revenge on Russia for the help it unselfishly provided. And I'm saying this makes no sense. That Russia cannot say, this is an ambivalent argument, we were saying. It collapses on its head and it is quite laughable. Because this, in fact, the argument is convoluted. How can you, in one breath, say that you are denazifying Ukraine from Western values, from Americanism, and at the same time, and also you are saying that Ukraine is being used as a puppet by the West to penetrate Russia and to control Russia? And so your special operation is draining Ukraine from this. And at the same time, the article ends by saying that everything that Russia has done, it has done at its own expense by making the greatest sacrifices. How is that? That argument is ambivalent. You cannot, in one breath, say that you are helping the West by draining Ukraine, by talking of draining Ukraine of Western values. Why would, and I said earlier before the interruption, if America already thinks that if you say America thinks that its values are of a higher caste or it is exceptional, and why would America come in there, Russia's help, in draining Ukraine of American values, a value? If another country is adopting their way of life and their lifestyle, why would America want Russia to make sacrifices to prevent that from happening? That makes no sense. And I say to you, the only reason he can make this argument is because he's talking to Russians. He's not talking to people to West and to other. He's talking to the Russians. And I said to you, communication is to make popular what was the monopoly. And he has control of information. And he's selling a lie. But first of all, this very same article suggests something else, that he's trying to, that they are suspicious of American values, and that Americanism is the new kind of denazification, is the new kind of Nazism in the world that is trying to take hold, and they are trying to prevent that. And at the same time, at the end, They are saying that they are helping the US or America or the West to deal with Ukraine. And then the article goes on to say, from here on, Russia will go on its own way without worrying about the fate of the West in the building on another part of its legacy, leadership in the global decolonization process. So this is laughable. Putin and Russia here says that it is helping the West. It is helping the West, or it was helping the West, or helping the US to decolonize. When what it is doing in Ukraine, it is a kind of colonization, but of a different color and make that I talk about neoliberalism or the neoliberal. The neoliberalism or the neoliberal is just a name that suggests strategy. It's a strategy. It is duplicitous and hypocritical. You say that you are helping to the West to drain the world of colonialism or colonization, but at the same time, you are still utilizing the same, and even outlined in this very same article, what you intend to do with Ukraine through processes of colonization. So in a sense, you're trying to transport or replace one kind of control with another. Does that make sense? Does that make it right? So that's what I'm saying. The argument is laughable. Further, further it says from here on, Russia will go on its own way without worrying about the fate of the West. Excuse me, what I said earlier before the interruption, and Russia has already been going on its own. When it went into Crimea, against the urgings of the US and other countries, and against sanctions, and it has created several aggressions and intimidations in the world. It even invaded Georgia. It went on its own. And when it invaded Ukraine, Russia and Putin decided that on their own. That wasn't a collaborative effort. So it is laughable and it is narcissistic. That's a narcissistic kind, and that's what people who are in power develop, that level of narcissism, to believe as though they have arrived. Their power is justified. Their privilege is justified. In a monarchical system, or in a world where we were ruled by nobles and kings and queens and emperors and the Pope, they believed that their authority and their power came from God. They appealed to something from above so as to trick people into being complicit in accepting their lives being dominated by somebody else who has hijacked power for themselves, appealing to an ideology that was universalized for that very same purpose, to increase, to establish, or to maintain power. They appeal to some higher power. You see all this instance of, you see how power works through certain principles and ideologies, which is, when you study historical literature, it is all, and it's not just Western society, but even Eastern societies, because here we are talking about Russia and even China and the issue with Taiwan. And we talk about recently in an article, the world now has two more global challenges in addition to racism and all the other isms that we have in the world. We have a neoliberalism. We talk about a strategy, this narcissism to believe that I have a right. This is quite hypocritical. From here on now, Russia will try to go on its own. Russia has been going on its own for a very long time. And it says leadership in the global decolonization process. If this is what leadership looks like, then we do not want that kind of leadership. And that's the next thing. They are trying to say that they are on a world-saving mission to lead the world, but this is not leadership. As if people don't understand what leadership is. The people who they're leading, do they want this kind of leadership? So in a sense, they have hijacked power for themselves and determined a kind of principle and is leading the world towards that, a world that does not accept that kind of leadership. So it's a totalitarian, despotic kind of understanding of leadership and process. The article concludes by saying, as part of this process, Russia has high potential for partnership and alliance with countries that the West has oppressed for centuries and have no intention of putting its yoke back on. Without Russian sacrifice and struggle, these countries would not have been liberated. The denazification of Ukraine is at the same time its decolonization. Something the Ukrainian population will have to realize as it begins to free itself from the ghosts, temptations, and dependencies of the so-called European choice. Russia is upset and is reacting to another sovereign country's choice, freedom of choice, to another country's idea of independence, to another country's way of life. Russia is going to war and has written an elaborate article justifying why they are going to war against another country, because the country has chosen a particular way of life that is opposed to the Russian way of life, a way of life that they want. Russia. It's, you read the story, if you read the Bible, the Genesis story about creation, and in the story, the Christian Holy Bible talks about a situation where Adam and Eve had two sons, Cain and Abel. One was a farmer, one was a herder, cattle herder, or whatever. They both were called to give sacrifices to their dad, to their father, Adam. I believe that's how the story went. Abel's sacrifice or gift was accepted, but Cain's gift was accepted. And do you know what happened in the story that was told here? Cain became jealous because their father had accepted Abel's gift, and because of that he reacted, lashing out, killing Abel because of a decision that was made. This is why the dynamics of the stories of are a little bit different in terms of the parallels. It's the same thing, because the story ended by saying, the article ended by saying the denazification of Ukraine is at the same time its decolonization. Something the Ukrainian population will have to realize as it begins to free itself from the ghosts, temptations, and dependencies of the so-called European choice. The choice it has made to incorporate a kind of independence and a kind of value that seem to be American or Western. And so it is willing to kill and to destroy and to destroy, to genocide, to kill his brother or his sister for a decision it made to adopt a particular value. Man has, you see the story, it is You see this story, it is contained in history. It is not a new story. This drive that man have to be willing to even kill to get his or her way. The willingness to destroy somebody else over decisions made. Decisions that the other does not like. Because they prejudice a particular decision, or because they do not appreciate a particular decision. Now, I had actually written an article about this, and I'd also, it is contained in the Neoliberal Post via the RenaldoMcKenzie.com website, and it is also and I also did a podcast presentation called Putin Speech, March 16, 2022, he reveals his mind, where I talk about some of these issues. I wrote an article published, and I was saying this earlier, that I wrote the article some time ago. And I wrote that Putin's latest speech, he revealed his mind, and I delved into it, lifting up some very important points and highlighted red flags and signal warnings. And I said to you, it is an esoteric speech. It speaks to the issue of Orientalism and Occidentalism. I said to you that Putin believes the West think it's of a higher caste and is not to be trusted, for they only use peoples and treat them as expendable. He justifies genocide or murder or killing Ukrainians and those who side with the West as a purification mechanism to strengthen Russia, all of Russia, including the former Soviet countries. In this speech, he reveals his true intentions to unite all of Russia by cutting down and cutting off those who side with the West and believe that Western values about, example, gender equality are better than Russians' position on gender equality. According to Putin, you can be for gender equality, but don't force it on us. Don't believe that it's better than our position that puts men and women in their proper place. Indeed, I said in the article and in the podcast, that Putin believes that the West assumes that its progressive or democratic or Slavish ways of life are better than Russia. He believes the former USSR countries have lost their way and are adopting Western ways at the expense of Russia. And in order to save and preserve Mother Russia and its children from departing from that which is truly Russian, we must spew them out, even if it means going to war. And I say to you in the article and in a previous episode that this is extremism, the kind of extremism, the same kind of extremism that seems to be growing everywhere in the world.
Повторю в том, что многие из таких людей по своей сути ментально находятся именно там, а не здесь, не с нашим народом, не с Россией.
Welcome back. We were saying before we were interrupted that this is extremism as it relates to Putin and the speech that he gave, which the speech was on March 16, and this article that we just obtained is actually speaking to the very same ideological basis and justification for this war that we had written about on March 17 regarding Putin's speech that we had obtained on March 16. We said that this is extremism, the kind of extremism that seems to be growing everywhere. It was just recently where it happened here in the US, when white extremists marched to the US Capitol, who many believe were under the influence and motivation of Donald Trump or some political leaders to stop the VP from certifying the US 2020 presidential election, a democratic process here in the US. Further, I said that Putin is being duplicitous and hypocritical when he says others believe their way is better, while he is forcing his way as the way for all Russia to follow, prejudicing a way of life and expecting all to subscribe to that or be killed. Further, one may argue that once it was the way of life, and I said this, one may argue that once it was the way of life, but when a way of life or a taboo is no longer a taboo and now accepted as part of the new way of life, then there is a backlash from the status quo. Putin's efforts, according to his speech, is saving Russian values, ideologies, and lifestyle, which is actually the old holding on to a past, quickly leaving them. Russian conservative traditional values must be protected and preserved at all costs. This was what I said in this, as I analyzed his speech, and of course it's revealed here. I went on to say that so Putin's goals do not stop with Ukraine. It only starts there. For his mission is to force the other former Soviet countries to fall in line or die. Not in the sense that they must join Russia and give up their nation, but more so for these countries to maintain the Russian way of life, values and principles, and not behave as if the West is better and that Russia must bend to their way. This is what make all of Russia weak and put Mother Russia and her children in a vulnerable position to be taken over by the West. For Putin believed that the West is invading Russia ideologically, and that is the highest sin or evil that must be rooted out, even if it means war. For Putin here, I went on to say in the article, for Putin here, Russia is not just Russia in the geographic sense. Russia is the entire former Soviet countries in terms of its values, ideologies, and principles. The purity of this must be protected from the West, which are using the other USSR countries to penetrate so as to dominate all of Russia. Mother Russia, that is what we said. Putin is suspicious of the West and thinks we cannot be trusted, the West. But he also wants all Russia to keep its identity, even if the West thinks it's backward or unfair, and he is willing to kill thousands for those fears. But what if those countries want a separate identity? That is not all Russia. What if these former USSR countries accept certain Western values and realize for themselves the challenges of the current ones? That's treacherous, Putin would say, based on his comments. For no one must depart from the Russian way, even if the Soviet Union has been broken up. In effect, and this is from my analysis of the speech, in effect, Putin embodies this is my analysis of Putin's speech, the one on March 16th. In effect, Putin embodies totalitarianism and despotic leadership. And this is the same thing with this article. And I tell you, Putin wrote this article. If he believes that destroying lives for the sake of maintaining some ideological purity is salvific, then using nuclear weapons is absolutely not out of his reach or plan. The West must be warned that this current invasion is only the beginning, and we must do everything we can to stop Putin here before he expands his leverage and hold in the region. That's what's at stake. This was discussed. This was an article that was published in March 17. And I also did a podcast on this very. And today we obtained an article that is part of Putin's propaganda campaign that was published by the Russian news agency, the Russian state news agency that is controlled by Putin and Russia, calling for full-blown genocide and destruction of Ukraine as a state. But this article is not new. I mean, the ideas of this article, because this article is part of the campaign where they continue to put out articles and news reports justifying the war. And of course, and that is the way, that is how you brainwash people. You continue to sell the message in various different publications, the same message in various ways, hammering home the same thing over and over and over until it takes hold of a people. But if you are able to do proper analysis and you can critically analyze stuff, you look at this article, you can see the privilege, you can see the power, you can see the control, you can see the ambivalence and how convoluted he is. The fact, and even towards the end, he makes an allegation of saying that he's actually trying to decolonize, and he is leading the process of decolonization, partnering with the US to decolonize, when that is actually a hypocritical statement, which is a confusion and a departure from to the previous statement, an ambivalent statement, previous statement in the same article where he says that he's clearly suspicious of West and he's trying to drain Ukraine of the West. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Putin must be backed up, or must be at his last leg as well, to make such a mistake, because nowhere have we heard nowhere have we heard Putin saying that this is a partnership, a process of decolonization until now. It is because the war is getting away from him. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for if you were able to listen to the entire episode, I appreciate that. And I hope that you continue to, I hope you recognize what we are doing here at the Neoliberal Corporation and here at the Neoliberal Round. And you provide and you support our program. You support us because all of this is free. And we are all about dispelling disinformation and adding value to people's lives by providing information and trying to make analysis. Through this deconstructivism, using deconstructivist and critical methods to uncover and to unearth the truth, people's true intentions, and where those intentions are seeking to discriminate and to continue to perpetuate injustices and unfair dealings in the world. Thank you for listening to us, and continue to follow us on Twitter, Renaldo McKenzie, Instagram, Renaldo Kibis, or the Neoliberal. On Facebook, we are Renaldo.McKenzie, and on LinkedIn, we are Reverend.Renaldo-C-McKenzie. And of course, subscribe to our program, share it with your friends, and visit our webpage at https://renaldocmckenzie.com or https://theneoliberal.com. Take care and have a good day. Last year, 2022, it was, I believe, March of 2022, April of 2022, and the preceding video, which I referenced, the podcast I referenced with the Putin speech, was in March of 2022. But thank you so much for listening. This will be part of the discussion in the Neoliberal Globalization Reconsidered, Neo-Capitalism and the Death of Nations. You can join the discussion group on my academia.edu account. I'm having a discussion group, and you can see a summary or some summarized version of the book with the content. So far, since past the edition of that reviews. But this is the Neoliberal Round. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to hearing your reviews. Take care and walk good.